Now, tests on high-rise apartments have so far uncovered 11 residential buildings that are encased in cladding that can catch fire. The material's been blamed for accelerating the fire that killed at least 79 people in a West London tower block last week. The government's identified 600 buildings in England alone with cladding that needs to be tested, and further urgent checks are going to be carried out over the next few days. Addressing the Commons, Theresa May said every possible step was being taken to ensure all the buildings were safe. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said the Grenfell tragedy demanded a step change in the country's attitude towards social housing. Monica Wopolensky can see Grenfell Tower from her flat on the 19th floor.
It's like a reminder every time you look through this window. This could be us. I would move today, yesterday. In our tower block is probably 500, 600 people, and I spoke to other residents, and it doesn't matter if they live on 19th floor, 7th floor, 3rd floor, they still want to move. They're worried. They don't want to be here.
Andrew Teacher's an independent property expert and founder of Blackstock Consulting, which specialises in real estate. I asked him if he was surprised at the number of buildings that are considered to be a risk.
Considering how many buildings we have of a similar vintage to Grenfell, I think it's probably at the better end of what we could have expected, to be frank with you. I think the reality of the situation is that this comes after decades of neglect and decades of underinvestment in social housing. And as a country, I think we need to take stock, we need to take politics out of it, and we need to find a cross-party political situation to this where we're realistic with the public around the costs of rectifying the situation we now have.
Clearly, we're going to be in a situation, aren't we, where anyone who finds that their building is clad in similar cladding to the stuff that was put on the side of the Grenfell Tower, they're going to want it changed.
Well, I think we need to be clear on that. And I think there has been a degree to which there has been a fair amount of scaremongering, a fair amount of knee-jerk reacting from all sides of the media. And what we've seen over the last 7 days is that every single person is now an expert in cladding, which is a phrase that very few people in the real world knew before last Wednesday. There were very few people you would meet in the pub or the supermarket that would even understand the word cladding unless they worked in construction. I think the reality of it is that the cladding is only a problem if there aren't appropriate other mitigating measures being taken. So the reality of it is the tragic events that we've witnessed over the last week would likely, and I don't want to prejudge the public inquiry and the investigation, and I don't claim to be a cladding or an engineering expert, but the reality of it is, had there been smoke extraction systems, had there been working sprinklers, the chances are that the situation would not have been quite as bad as it was last week. And that's what we need to be clear on, I think, in terms of our building regulations in this country, which, let's be honest, would have been cleared for Grenfell, for the other buildings that have been found today, the last few days. All of these buildings, past building regulations, past building regs as they're referred to in the sector, they would have had to been ticked off by a man or a woman with a clipboard that came along and said, do these pass the rules, yes or no, tick, 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 cross, cross, cross. They would have been ticked off. So that begs two questions. Is there a massive problem with all the building inspectors we have, and building inspection was something that was deregulated a few years ago, or is there a huge problem with the regulations themselves?
It's looking more and more like a sort of like a national scandal. If we did need to remove and change all of the cladding that was similar to the type used on Grenfell, is that practical? I mean, how much would it likely to cost?
Well, I mean, if we're just talking about 11 buildings, the cost isn't going to be huge relative to what it would cost if it were thousands of them. I think, again, that's why I stress about balance. I think for anybody listening to 5 Live, anybody listening to any other news outlets or reading stuff in the papers, just because you have a particular type of cladding, it doesn't mean your building is about to burn down. Because buildings of different height and of different builds they'll be made of different materials. I mean, very few buildings are the same. Secondly, there will be other systems in place such as sprinklers, such as smoke extraction, such as other fire suppression systems that will help and can help mitigate fire in the event of an event. So I think we need to think about things in the round and not just do what the media often does in these situations, is pick out one little thing and go, right, we're going to pull that thread until the jumper falls apart. It's not simply about cladding. It has to be about everything. It has to be about safety systems across the piece. And also it has to be about the operation and management of a building, because, in the same respect as it's the opposite, really. If you think about the opposite, it's just as much as I'm saying it's not about cladding. You can have the most up-to-date technologically advanced building in the world with the greatest fire suppression systems, but if nobody walks up and down the corridors and moves the rubbish out of the way of the fire door, then all of those fantastic things don't make a difference. So it's also a matter of how buildings are managed. Who's looking over them? What does the CCTV say? Are people taking responsibility for all sorts of things? And that plays a role in how safe a building is. It isn't simply about any one thing.
Is there a change of, you're describing there what seems to be a sort of a change of culture, root and branch. Do you think that we've become kind of complacent to fire in the last few years?
I don't think we have. I mean, I think in perhaps in certain areas a bit, but and certainly, I mean, before I set up the current business that I run, the consultancy that I run, I was at BAA for a couple of years, which is the company that it used to be the name of the company that owns Heathrow Airport and many of the other airports, which have subsequently been sold. And certainly for what's one of the biggest pieces of infrastructure in Europe, it was something that they took very seriously, and many of the businesses that I've seen and worked with over the years do take it very seriously. I think there is a challenge in social housing, not necessarily because of bad management, although there are huge questions over the management of Kensington on the particular issue we're talking about. But across the piece, people want to do the best thing, but that requires funding. It requires investment. And we're in a landscape where social housing has been massively underfunded by successive governments of all colours. That hasn't been helped by the cuts to social rent last year, but these problems have been brewing for years. They've been brewing since the 80s. And the reality of it is that we can't keep you can't keep pulling away at stuff and then complain when there's nothing left. And the point is, managing buildings isn't a cheap thing. You can't continue chipping away at costs in the way that we have done. And that's, I think, where we are now revealing the corners that have been cut, not just in management of buildings, but in construction. So some of the issues that we're seeing today, we've seen the BBC reporting and other news outlets reporting around particular councils that are now on the verge of taking legal action because the people that have constructed some of their social housing buildings haven't done a particularly good job. They've used different cladding from the ones that have been ordered, largely to save money, and that will probably result in a fair amount of legal action taking place. But it's important to understand that the context of this is a culture of cost cutting. It's a culture of trying to save money so that even £5,000 or £10,000, which is reportedly the cost of the slightly higher, better grade of cladding on Grenfell, that people are looking at that sort of difference in cost saving because of the pressures being placed upon them.
How much of a watershed do you think this will end up being for building regulations and fire regulations in particular?
It needs to be up there with the King's Cross fire tragedy of the 80s. Inconceivably before that, people used to smoke on the tube. People used to smoke on escalators, and that was what caused that fire was a cigarette on one of the escalators, one of the wooden escalators. So things need to change, and the world needs to become safer, and social housing needs to improve so that this terrible tragedy hasn't totally been in vain.
Andrew Teacher, an independent property expert and founder of Blackstock Consulting, with those continuing questions about the Grenfell Tower fire and the aftermath.